Conversations.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Strong Conversations, Hot Takes from a Cultural Firebrand. I am still Dr. Carolyn Strong, your host, and per usual, we're going to jump right in. Thank you for joining us. For those of you that have kind of been keeping up with the comings and goings and comings, I've been doing a series called What Will It Look Like When Black Lives Matter in School? And today, we're going to have awesome guests, per usual, and we're going to talk about wraparound equity. Last time we talked about what it will look like when Black Lives Matter in school, specifically with math curriculum. So today we're going to talk about wraparound equity. However, before we do that, I do want to kind of talk about some of the points that we did touch on in the Do Black Lives Matter in School panel, and then go from there. And then I'll let you all introduce yourselves because you are the you experts. So when we did the Do Black Lives Matter in School panel, some of the data that we looked at was from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and it said that Black youth are 15.5% of public school students, but represented in about 39% of students suspended from school. And that the disparity is not solely based on differences in behavior. And as somebody that's been a disciplinarian for 15 plus years, discipline is probably the most arbitrary part of school. So we know how that goes. Black girls are suspended at 5 times the rate of their white counterparts. Black disabled youth are more likely to be educated in segregated classrooms and are less likely to graduate than their white disabled counterparts. Queer and gender nonconforming Black youth are also disciplined at high rates and often not protected by the safe spaces created for their white counterparts. When it comes to advanced placement and gifted classes, they largely exclude Black youth, and students are left out of gifted programs and more pushed into special ed programs, and they get a reductive curriculum and teaching that values compliance over learning and relationships that prioritize surveillance. So, needless to say that we came to the conclusion that no, Black lives do not matter in school. So now I'm going to spend the next several weeks talking to seasoned experts in this field that are out here in these streets and doing this work about what it looks like when that is a priority for you. So with that being said, we all know that here I let my guests introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Dr. Coles. Who are you? How are you? And tell us about you.
Well, first of all, thank you for grounding us in this amazing conversation and asking the question that a lot of us are skirting around, which is, do Black Lives Matter in schools? And basically, we are clearly pointing in many directions to absolutely not. And if we are saying that they do matter, we need to start showing our work, just like we ask our students to do in the math classroom. We ask them to show their work. We now need to be showing our work if we do believe that. So my name is Jamela Coles, Dr. Jamela Coles. I am the Director of Teacher Leadership at Mount Holyoke College. I'm also a professor at the University of Georgia, where I teach disability studies interdisciplinarily. So I teach interdisciplinary disability studies to educators, to people who will go into business, people who will go into marketing, people who will go into biology, who will go into several different parts of the medical field. So focusing on disability, but also intersectionality as it relates to disability. And at Mount Holyoke, the program that I run is a teacher leadership program, and we ground our work in social justice education. So making sure that teacher leaders who are doing the work of a teacher leader, they are grounded in understanding social justice and equity. They are grounded in understanding outreach and advocacy and what it means to be an ally, a co-conspirator in the work in education.
Thank you for understanding that pre-service teachers need this work. I've been fighting for that in some of these pre-service teacher streets, and doing an equity walk is not enough, where you send your pre-service teachers into the community for one day to observe like an episode of National Geographic. But I digress. I'm sorry. Mr. Minkle, how are you? Welcome, Dr. Coes.
I'm great. I have been working with Dr. Coes for about 7 years in some capacity, but earlier this year we started working together on an initiative that Jamela and our colleague Josh Parker started through NSTOY, the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, called All for Equity. So that's going to be part of what we talk about today. I've been a teacher for about 20 years, first, second, third, and fourth grade. I've always taught first and second generation immigrants in high poverty public schools. So I'm really excited to be here and be part of the conversation.
Awesome. So neither of you is in a K-12 setting at the moment. So that is why I wanted to talk to you all. And it was so ironic, Dr. Coles, when I got your bio, it talked about the through line of equity. And that was what the point of this show was. Like, when we talked about it, it was we want to see what those wraparound services look like. And that sometimes what we do when we think of equity, and we're kind of still here, we're working to not be here, is that it's a box that we have to check. And it's something that we have to do instead of a space that you need to live in as a human. And so we get into this mindset of, all right, we did that at school. All right, that equity thing is done. And that's just not how equity moves by definition. So what are you all working on that takes us through, that weaves equity through other things?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So as Justin mentioned, what we are working on is a platform called All for Equity, and it includes 4 different prongs, right? The first one is Build for Equity. And basically Build for Equity is about how do you recruit, retain, and advance educators that are in the classrooms, particularly as it relates to Black and Brown educators. How do we move them through the education system to not only attract them to it, but also to lead it? So what we wrote about was the necessity of Black and Brown educators to have to, one, be in the space for all students, and then to change the dynamics of the space so that others can enter. So when we're thinking specifically about building for equity, we are talking about what conditions need to be in place so that educators would want to be there. Because what we're finding is that we are creating conditions in which Black and Brown educators would not even want to enter the classroom spaces. Specifically, as we're looking at the news right now, we are looking at specific legislation in states that say we do not want to teach about race and equity and justice. And why would an educator who has experienced any
and you can't say gay.
And gay, don't forget, don't say gay, right? So when we're looking at all of these things intersectionally, we are creating bars and barriers for people to be even interested in wanting to enter the profession, which will impact the students who are already there and the students who are to come. So when we're thinking about that through line, we're thinking about it from the very beginning and then all the way through. And I'm going to let Justin talk a little bit about Teach for Equity, which is what we are building for teachers who are already in the classroom, for them to start to embody the ethos of what we're calling habits of equity, right? An unconscious connection to equity in all that they do, like just part of their being. So Justin, you can tell us about that.
So Dr. Coes, Josh Parker, and I have been working with Dr. Richard Warren and Meg Freeman as they developed this 6-week course about equity. And what I love about it is that a lot of teachers have experienced professional development where you come in and you're in a cafeteria with like 150 teachers and someone's lecturing to you from like technology you forgot existed. And it feels like you're kind of this empty vessel just kind of getting filled up with information. And this course is so different, I think, because it respects who teachers are as a person and as a professional, but also acknowledges that I think most teachers feel like they can do a better job in terms of equity. And it helps create a bridge between who that teacher is right now and the teacher that they want to become, which I think is such a different approach because we hear a lot about monitoring and compliance. And I think a lot of times the same systems that are created for adults end up really trickling down to how teachers then in turn treat their students. And I think that's especially true for kids of color. It's especially true in high poverty schools. So what I love about this course is that it does create that bridge, and it's not like you're trying to do this really hard, important work because it's required, but it's because who you want to become in order to do right by your students. Dr. Jamilico, is anything you would add to that about the course?
Yeah, just that the course is designed to, as I stated a little bit before, is just to make it so that equity becomes unconscious, like just part of what we do, right? So like in the morning, you wake up, you brush your teeth, you wash your face, you just do the thing, right? Right now, equity feels like something extra for teachers to have to do, to have to think about. But this course is helping teachers to understand, like, no, it's just a part of your being. It's a part of what you do every day. It is embedded intentionally in your work. And once you do it enough, once you can recognize the spaces in which equity should and can live, we just feel it. We just fill those spaces naturally.
And that's part of the uphill battle too, is because educators we're probably the field that suffers from the most initiative fatigue, because we're always the ones that are expected to pivot. When a new president comes in, we know that a new I can't even think of the secretary of education is coming in, and we already know that we're finna get some new acronyms that our money's attached to. So what I experience when I come into equity spaces, for me as a presenter and as a workshop leader, is that they've put equity in that box. A lot of them have put equity in that box. Equity is in that box of, let's just keep it a buck. Equity is in that box of Ish that's not going to be here long. And if I just sit here and smile and eat my box lunch, by the time I finish, they will have moved on to the next thing. And so one of the things that I have to try and impart upon people is that my right to fully exist as an actualized, living, breathing, human, intersectional being is not an unfunded mandate. And that's step one. And I think that that's kind of where the difference is. We're not talking about where you carry the one or a Common Core, or whether or not we're teaching canon versus graphic novels. Those are the things that change based on who's in the big chair. But me being human and having a right to live my best life, whatever that looks like, should not be a part of the negotiation. So that's where it becomes difficult to explain to a lot of educators in terms of how this is different. So how do you all combat that? Because you already know that, because a lot of this stuff is most of this stuff is still optional. At least it is for me where I am. So when you do have that every now and then piece that everybody has to come to, you have the people that sit in the front row like this that are ready for you to leave. And then you do have that small group that's genuinely interested. And then everybody else is there, to quote Marshawn Lynch, they just there so they don't get fined. So how do we approach this? What is it that we need to say? Because we know we're not going to get them all. Statistically, that's just not how things move. But how do we get the ones that are like, I guess I'll go and see what they're talking about? How do we move that?
So I've been thinking a lot about that because I've been doing a lot of PD with various schools, and I'm thinking, all right, I got to get you to see, I got to be able to pull, like, the ones that are with me, they're already with me, right? And then the ones that are in the middle are the ones that I know that I can do a little something with. And then the ones that are, they're just not ready. That's all right, right? That's a space to be in for them. But one way that I've recently approached it, I think that most educators can understand in a very concrete way, is for them to first look at the tactical teachings that they are applying to their students versus the adaptive teachings that they are applying to their students. So when you ask the question of, do Black Lives Matter, and what will it look like when Black Lives Matter in schools? what it will look like is that we go beyond teaching students, this is how you do this thing, this is how you walk straight in line, this is how you do exactly this thing, and we're pointing from A to B and just connecting them from A to B. It will go from that into, here is what you have at your disposal. How are you going to use it to think about things differently, to think about things that matter, to change the world around you? And we'll give students the tools to actually think, which is what we are saying that we are doing, but we are not actually doing in practice. So when Black Lives Matter, we will honor all of the funds of knowledge that our students bring into our classroom spaces and allow them to use those funds of knowledge in order to get to the places that we think education can take them. Because right now we're not doing that. We are super restrictive and super regimented, and it is not to the benefit of our students. We are not thinking about community. We are thinking about the individual. So when Black Lives Matter, we will be thinking about community rather than this very individualistic idea that we have about schooling. So when I talk to teachers about what they are doing, the tactical things that they are doing, and trying to get them to the adaptive things, they start to open their minds into thinking about how they can do a few things differently, right? Because the thing is, it's not to have everyone flip the whole system over at one time, although I would love to see it. I would love to see it. That is a big ask, I think, for many people, and many people are not ready for that. But if we can just change a few things immediately. In fact, Justin was like, we talk often because we're working on so many projects together, and what he said is, education can't be perfect, but it can be better. And it can absolutely be better for Black students if we just make some little changes, little bit at a time, until we can flip over the system. Because
we had the opportunity to flip over the system when Rona shut everything down, and we just sat there and went, I can't wait to get back to normal.
Shamefully, you are correct.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. That I think sometimes teachers do feel overwhelmed because it's been an exhausting couple of years with the pandemic in a job that's already exhausting. And one thing I think I realized through our research is that there are a lot of things that make teaching really hard for all teachers, right? Like lack of professional autonomy, really insane schedules that are just not humane for the needs people have. But almost anything you look at that hits the profession in general hits teachers of color even harder. So a lot of our focus was talking about how, right now about 80% of teachers are white, even about half of America's students are students of color. And in a lot of districts, it's not even a goal to change that. The information is not even being collected. We're not setting kind of concrete goals for that. So I feel like one piece is diversifying the teaching force. And that was a lot of what we talked about with Build for Equity. I think in terms of the Teach for Equity piece, what Jamila said is so true, that if a teacher feels like they're doing everything wrong and they need to be perfect, it's hopeless. But if you look at just the little things you can do, even going through your classroom library, right, and taking a look and saying, all right, how many of these books really reflect the identities and experiences of my students, right? Thinking about the ways that you interact with students in terms of discipline, just the kind of conversations you have. I know when I was teaching first grade, I got rid of my behavior chart for a lot of different reasons. And it was really hard, and I started to get really frustrated when the kids weren't listening. And I realized, like, it's not disrespect. It's that listening is a skill that needs to be taught for 6-year-olds, right? And just sitting down and talking to them about why we listen, right? Instead of approaching it with this kind of monitor and compel approach. Our colleague Josh Parker was talking about this idea he heard in a district the other day of aggressive monitoring. That was the actual term. And I just think like we're treating some children in a way that no one would want their own son or daughter to be treated in school.
Oh, absolutely. We talked about that on the last show, and my guest said, look at the school that you're in. Is this someplace that you would want to send your child? Why is that? And to ask those questions. I do want to just talk about that pre-service piece that you were talking about. One of the ways that I find to be very mind-blowing for my students regarding that equity piece is doing a syllabus study. In terms of, let's pull some high school syllabi from some lower performing Black and brown schools, and let's pull some syllabi from some higher performing non-Black and brown schools. And when you see them side by side, like, people think, okay, we're going to look at syllabi, whatever. And then they start to notice that when you're looking in those Black and brown spaces, the first 2 pages are all rules. and everything that you can and cannot do. And in this class, you only get 2 bathroom passes because we're still regulating Black bodies. You get 2 bathroom passes a semester. If you don't use them, you get extra credit. So I'm going to regulate your body and tie it to your grade somehow. You can't do this, you can't do that, no eating, no drinking, no this, no that, no blah, 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 blah. That's the first 2 pages of the syllabus. Now you go over here to Socratic School on the Hill with the koi pond, and we get to talk about all the things that we are going to learn and how this is a free environment and all of these things. And when they sit there and they look at those syllabi side by side, they're just kind of like, well, damn. So, and that is one of the ways that I've been able to pull in some of, I don't want to say naysayers because that's a little harsh, but some of what we call them on the fencers, skeptics. Skeptics works. Some of my skeptics, and they're like, well, dang, well, when you put it this way, because usually when I walk into a room and they're like, okay, Dr. Strong's here to talk about equity and anti-racism, and they're like, oh, great, here's the lady here with the big hair that's ready to call me a racist. And it's not about that at all. It really is just about understanding how systemic and institutionalized these practices are, even down to the point that we don't explain things to Black and brown kids. We have, especially at, like you were talking, Justin, about that 6 and 7-year-old mark. We say things like do better, be good citizens, but we don't explain what those things mean, because the literal definition of bias basically is summed up to being the sum total of your experiences. And you take yourself wherever you go. And because of that, everybody's definition of those things is going to be different. So what this ends up boiling down to is that we spend egregious, obscene amounts of time holding children responsible for information we never gave them. And so how do we spend egregious amounts of time holding teachers responsible for information that we never gave them, especially in my area of discipline? Do we even in teacher prep have full-on classroom management, discipline, mindfulness, redirection courses? Because I didn't take one. Now, granted, I've been certified for 20 years, but I didn't take one.
So a couple of things. One, what you described is exactly what I was saying. The adaptive versus tactical orientation to learning and teaching. And in Black schools, what we see is tactical. What we see in schools that of non-Black students is the adaptive. We are giving them a space to grow and learn and think and do all of the things. And what I'd like to point out is that even in those spaces, what I think is incumbent upon all of us to think about, right? Whether we are Black, brown, white, however we identify, is, are we being anti-Black in any ways? Because I think that sometimes we think that just because we are Black, that we do not succumb to being anti-Black in some ways, and we do. So I think that we need to be thinking about that at the same time. The other thing, though, is within those systems, particularly if we're looking at a school that has a lot of Black students, and then we're thinking that maybe a lot of the teachers are Black, I'm thinking about the pressures on that teacher that come from the outside, right? So what pressure is being put on that teacher to say that you better get these kids to do this so that they can get this test score so that we can have this thing? So an interrogation of the system is always needed, always, for those teachers. But then what we hope is that they will take a second to look at what is in their circle of control, their locus of control. What are the things they can actually affect change in? Because I think sometimes they're like, well, they said I have to do it. Yeah, all right, that's cool. Sometimes they say you got to do the thing, but there's a lot of things that you do not have to do. A lot of things that you can do differently. And to your question about are there classes on classroom management specifically for pre-service educators? In good programs there are, but those classes aren't just about classroom management, right? They are about, like, how do you value a student in your classroom space? How do you facilitate learning rather than manage or restrict bodies? How do we honor people in their respective places? So in good programs, you will see classes that are more about mindfulness and facilitation techniques, and interrogating your curriculum so that your students actually want to pay attention rather than do something else. So
Yeah, and I think it's hard because I know when I was starting off teaching, in Harlem in New York City, I saw classroom management and instruction as two totally different things, right? And I had all these kind of external systems. And then what I started to realize early on was that, first of all, I had to think through the day from my students' perspective, right? Like, how much were they getting to move around? How many decisions were they getting to make? How much fun was it to be in my class, right? But then secondly, like, when I started to fix things, like, okay, the work is either too confusing or it's too easy or it's too boring, or they're not getting to talk enough. I'm talking too much, right? Or just the way that the materials are organized. Once I started to fix those things, I didn't need a lot of those external pieces because it was really about the instruction. They were completely interwoven. And then the other issue that I know everyone watching this is aware of is just the way we treat kids starting so young. When my son was in kindergarten, his best friend was African American and was sitting there in the lunchroom one day when my wife was visiting, and he was doing exactly what all the other kids are doing, right? Every single kid is acting silly because they're in the lunchroom, and he immediately is told to stand up and go sit facing the wall, right? And she went over and talked to him, and he said, I get in trouble every day and I just want to go home, and she gave him a hug and then later, addressed it with the teacher and the principal. But a lot of what Dr. Coase and I were working on is trying to increase the racial diversity of the teaching force. And the reality is that it's a cycle that can either be flipped to be positive, and right now is really negative. That if people have those kinds of experiences from the time they're in kindergarten, school isn't really a place that you want to go back to as a teacher later on. And a lot of it comes down to really kind of basic dignity and love and respect.
Well, that wraps it up in a nutshell. So I guess I my last talking point would be, besides how do we clone y'all? Like, if you had to sum up what it would look like when Black Lives Matter in school in 2 to 3 sentences, what would that look like? I know that's a tall order, but I got faith in y'all.
go ahead, Justin.
So a few things come to mind at different levels. One is that I think right now we see a lot more initiatives to recruit teachers of color than to really change the conditions to make it so teachers of color will want to stay, right? And so it's like, if we keep recruiting brilliant, passionate, caring people, but putting them in a system where some of the gatekeepers or people in power are treating them disrespectfully, or it's the kind of environment where it's really hard to do anything other than teach, and so the energy to be a human being, to be a parent, right, to take care of yourself, it's not sustainable. And so I think that's one piece, is that we really have to change some of the power structures that are there so that the teaching profession is a place that people want to join. And then beyond that, I think there are just some really concrete things, like just when you walk around the classroom, first of all, at a curriculum level, are the books reflective of students' experiences? Are we learning about a lot of different identities, a lot of different kinds of experiences? And in some ways, I think that's the easy part. I think what's harder is, the pedagogy. Like, one of our colleagues, Kimberly Worthy, a DC Teacher of the Year, went to an Afrocentric school. And the outcomes of this school were remarkable, partly because there were a lot of teachers of color there, but also it wasn't just the content that was reflective of the kids' identities and experiences, but it was the actual teaching methods. And again, I think this is a tall order, especially for white teachers who may not have been prepared. Right now, about 10% of our students are English learners, but about 40% of teachers have gotten any grounding in kind of how to teach English learners. But I think it goes back to what Dr. Coase said, that, the goal isn't necessarily to become perfect. It's to get a little bit better every day. And the last thing I would say is this metaphor that made me feel better when I was struggling as a teacher is, when you're walking in a light mist, right? At some point you're damp, and then you're wet, and then at some point you're drenched, right? But it's hard to tell when that happened. And so I think that kind of gradual process can happen for teachers who really want to do right by their students and make school a place that's more joyful and respectful and meaningful for them to be their whole human selves.
So I'll wrap it up really quickly. When Black Lives Matter in schools, it will look like places where students want to be, want to learn, and find value in their learning. So if we are still teaching how to draw a stem and leaf plot, and it's not connected to anything, we should stop teaching how to draw a stem and leaf plot that's not connected to anything. All right. We need to start thinking about what is applicable and useful. Does the classroom look like we are talking about the world that our students are experiencing? Because whether we are talking about it or not, they are experiencing it, and they are listening to what we are teaching and to what we are not teaching. So it will look like a place where they are feeling valued because they know that their teachers are watching and thinking about their lives outside of this classroom space and creating pathways for them to move forward. And it will look like community. It will look like I care about you. And my teacher cares about me. I care about my fellow students. It looks like we are doing this thing called life together. We are building society and community together. And most importantly, it will look like radical joy, just a happiness that exudes all understanding, even with the things that we know we need to fix in society. It will go beyond that when Black Lives Matter in schools.
Well, y'all have blessed my soul today. I appreciate you all for coming to talk to me. I appreciate you sharing your truth and your work. Is there some place that you want people to find and or follow you? If not, that's okay. Just let me know, or let people know where they can tweet you, message you, however that looks.
Sure. So you can follow me at Jamela Codes on Instagram, which I don't post a lot on Instagram, but I will respond. Twitter, LinkedIn, all of those are at Jamela Codes, and then www.jamelacodes.com.
And I'm on Twitter at Justin Minkel, Minkel, and I've written about 120 columns, mostly for Education Week. So if you just Google my name in Education Week, some of those will come up. Like I wrote a piece called, How White Teachers Can Do Right by Students of Color. That's just really practical. And then also NSTOY is the organization we're talking about, NNSTOY, and they're on Instagram and also on Twitter. And thank you so much, Dr. Strong, for the invitation and for all the work that you're doing every day. It's so hard, and I'm really grateful that you're out there.
It really is, but society is worth it. So what can you do? I thank everybody for tuning in. You guys know where to find me. I'm on Facebook at Strong Conversations. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Carolyn Strong. I thank you all again, and I'll talk to y'all next time. Until then, have the best day you can.